The Stray Kids performing on stage right now are completely different from who they were in 2018, but you already know that. They've grown and evolved exceptionally through the years because they obsess over perfectionism. Most groups get one shot at a title track. However, Stray Kids wrote 15 candidates just to pick one, and when the next album came around, they did it again. This is a group that has never once settled, and you can hear exactly where that obsession took them. When they debuted, 3 members wrote every song they released. Not most songs, every single one. The other 5 members performed what the 3 had made. And for the first few years, that's exactly how it stayed. But 4 years later, every single member had their own officially released solo. That gap between a unit of 3 producers and a team of 8 doesn't close overnight. A lot had to happen. So then that raises the question, what did happen between that point? And to fully understand how they ever closed that, we have to go back to before Stray Kids was formed. If you enjoy thoughtful, positive content about Stray Kids just like this, consider subscribing. In 2016, 3 JYP trainees started uploading music to SoundCloud without the company knowing. Bangchan, Changbin, and Han, going by CB97, Spear B, and J1, and over the course of a year, they released 37 songs. No one had asked them to write these songs, they simply wanted to by their own interest. One of those songs was Start Line, released to commemorate 3RACHA's first anniversary. On March 25th, 2018, Stray Kids debuted. Their first album, I Am Not, had 8 songs, with all of them being written and produced by 3RACHA. The way those songs got made tells us a lot about who these 3 people were at this point. Han and Changbin came up with the concept for Mirror by sitting in front of an actual mirror at the training center and just staring at themselves until the idea arrived. But then there's also Changbin, who bought a philosophy book on his own. Not because anyone suggested it, but because he wanted to write a philosophically deep song. He says he takes huge pride in those songs. He looked at what he'd made and decided it needed more foundation underneath it. The other 5 members were doing something different during this period. They were performing, training, getting better at the things they were already doing. During the I Am Not sessions, Ian wrote, "You're doing a good job," on his phone screen. At this point, he likely didn't want to put himself out there to the other members that he was still struggling with performing and getting his vocals down. So he would put it on his phone where it's more discreet and he can encourage himself in that way. Lino improved dramatically across all 8 songs of the debut album. Bangchan noticed and added quietly, "To be honest, I don't think he knows that yet." They were growing, but they weren't quite writing yet. Then between I Am Not and I Am Who, Bangchan took vocal lessons. The lessons changed how he heard the other members. Before, he wrote what he wanted to express. After, he started thinking about what each specific voice could actually carry. He talked about Ian during the I Am Who era.
저희 아인이 처음 만났을 때 표현을 하자면 그냥 하얀 종이였어요.
For I Am Who, 3RACHA wrote 15 title track candidates. 15. The same instinct that sent Changbin to a philosophy book was still running wild in them. The standard they held themselves to kept growing, even 2 albums in. That pressure found its way into the music itself. Since debut, people had been calling their sound noisy, and somewhere in that noise, something was changing. The styles they were drawn to were changing. Their idea of what a song should do was changing with it. 3RACHA have actually shown an older version of I Am You. The original had more of a chant style in the chorus. The version they released feels intentional in a different way. Like a conclusion, like something that knew where it was going. That's not the same group that stared at a mirror until a concept appeared. They were becoming deliberate. Miro arrived in March 2019. It was bigger than anything they'd put out before. A few weeks later, they won at M Countdown, their first music show win. When their names were called, some of them cried. Bangchan cried. The win certainly didn't settle anything. The noise label spread further after winning, not less, because 3RACHA had built something specific enough that people couldn't ignore it, and specific enough that people who didn't like it had something concrete to reject. Every sample, every sound effect, every line, these were deliberate decisions made by specific people, and the criticism landed exactly there. Less than 3 months after Miro, they released Side Effects. The song was denser, much more disorienting than the last. Bang-chan talks about the song's purpose.
네, 다른 길로 했었으면 어땠을까? 아니면 이 길로 했었으면 좀 더 편하지 않았을까? 더 잘 되지 않았을까? 이런 생각들도 가지게 되는 것 같은데
3 people were carrying the creative identity of 8, writing everything, producing everything, directing recordings, managing feedback, all of it, while the whole world argued whether what they were doing was music at all. The other 5 were becoming better performers. Lino was learning to express choreography in his own style rather than replicating it, but 3 people can only hold so much for so long. Up to this point, each physical copy of their album featured a secret mixtape track. Each of the songs were rewritten versions of early songs 3RACHA released on SoundCloud. However, all of Stray Kids actually participated in writing the lyrics to the songs. So while the others were getting experience with writing lyrics, they weren't in deep with the whole songwriting process yet. That was still mostly up to 3RACHA. Double Knot came out on October 9th, 2019. It's the last release with all 9 original members. 19 days later, Woojin left the group. JYP released a brief statement about it, citing personal circumstances, and the members said nothing about it publicly. The album was largely finished at this point. 8 members had to carry on what the 9 had built, and what came out the other side is what we now know as Clay Levanter. However, before any of that, 3RACHA had spent a week in LA. It was the first time they'd worked with international producers, sitting in rooms with people who made music completely differently than they did, and they absorbed everything. In 1 week, they wrote 15 songs. Han talked about what it felt like to be there, wanting to stop and genuinely not being able to. He said he was afraid of falling behind, afraid that resting meant treading water. He wrote a song called Sunshine during that week, not about being rested, but about wanting to be. He described it as the ideal break rather than a real one. 3 minutes of something he was giving listeners because he couldn't take it himself. Levanter, the song, is quieter than anything they'd made before. To this day, it's still their most reserved title track. Bang-chan had been reading a poem in which it says, "The wind is rising, we must try to live," and that image became the center of the whole thing. Changbin talked about the song as being about letting go of something you desperately wanted in your life, and how that can lead somewhere better. Han had his first serious slump during this period. He described it as the first time he'd had a hard time in his mind, and genuinely hadn't known how to overcome it, or how to tell anyone. He made a song out of it, wrote his way through it because that was the only tool he had. He later said he comforted himself while writing it, and then found out, when it came out, that other people needed the same thing. With Go Live, 3RACHA abandoned their concept-first style for the first time.
아 그래 그러면 우리 그냥 하고 싶은 거 다 하자.
Then Changbin played the group a new demo. The album was essentially finished. The original title track was recorded. Everything was in its final stages when Changbin played God's Menu anyway. Hyunjin said he knew immediately he wanted to perform it. The whole group agreed. Changing the lead single that late meant undoing finished work and asking for something that, by their own account, had never been done at JYP before. But they asked anyways. JYP listened to the guide track and said it made him picture them flying on stage. The change was approved. When Bang-chan talked about the album afterward, he didn't talk about proving anything. He said the process itself felt like an answer. And then separately, it's not 3RACHA's music, it's Stray Kids' music. That shift mattered beyond the album it came from, because at the same time, something else had already been moving and building for months. Before Skiz Replay was an official streaming release, it was known as Skiz Player and Skiz Record, a YouTube series. There was no album cycle behind them, no label rollout, it was just members uploading music 1 track at a time, with the kind of freedom that a proper studio release never really allows them. Han released a track through it called Close, about a period of wanting to be recognized and not being able to get there, likely written from that exact experience. Other members started showing up with their own ideas over the following months, not because anyone asked them to, but because the space was there, and low stakes enough to just try something new. In June 2021, a track came out called Up All Night with Bang-chan, Changbin, Felix, and Seungmin. But what made it so notable is that it was a reworked version of the very first song Bang-chan had ever written as a trainee. He hadn't been able to finish it on his own back then. Years later, with 3 other members, it finally came together the way he always wanted it to. The gap between 3racha and the rest of the group never closed in a single moment or a single decision. It closed across 2 years of YouTube uploads, in tracks that most people discovered by accident, where someone who had never written a song for a real release could quietly find out if they could. While Stray Kids were in LA for their District 9 Unlock World Tour, they ended up splitting up. 3racha went off to write more music, whereas the rest of the members worked on their dance skills. Lino talked about his experience. Without joking, the energy was... I think I learned how to express myself through the dance. I was in awe. It was so different from what we did in Korea. Then came No Easy, and with it, something that had never happened on a Stray Kids album before. For the first time, members outside of 3racha wrote unit tracks for the main release. Up to this point, they'd only contributed to the lyrics, but now they were helping with the songwriting itself. Bangchan also described what was different about this album compared to the last. He said that with Go Live, the challenge was finding a new personality for Stray Kids. But with No Easy, they already knew what that personality was, and now they were just pushing it further. In the No Easy intro, Ian talked about how he still writes "You're doing a good job" to himself during sessions that weren't working right. Even 3 years later, he was still encouraging himself in the same way. Not necessarily because he was scared to talk to the others, but because it was something familiar for him. Ordinary pushed Han to do something he'd never done before. The Maniac track felt completely foreign when he first heard it.
처음에 트랙을 딱 들었을 때 지 상태가 됐어요. 그 전에는 뭔가 곡 작업을 할 때나 아예 그런 생각을 안 했거든요.
He pushed through it anyway though, and when Hyunjin heard the finished version, he compared it to the feeling of hearing God's Menu for the very first time. He believed it was going to be a hit, and he was right. Ordinary became not only their first entry on the Billboard 200, but their first #1 on it too. The other members got a chance to show off their writing skills on the album as well, with 2 unit songs, Waiting for Us and Muddy Water. Later in the year, with Maxident, Sungmin and Ian wrote Can't Stop together with a very specific goal. They wanted something people could sing along to at a concert, which meant deliberately going against what anyone expected from a vocal unit.
뭔가 보컬라차 하면은 약간 발라드를 할 것 같고 가창력이 돋보이는 곡을 할 것 같다는 예상을 하잖아요. 보통 저희는 약간 색다르게.
It was 2 members deciding what they wanted their music to do, on their own terms. In December 2022, Stray Kids released Skiz Replay, an album where every single member had their own solo track, officially, on streaming platforms. All 8 of them at the same time. The A side had a solo track for every member. Lino's Limbo, Felix's Deep End, Sungmin's Stars and Raindrops, all of them, properly released on streaming for the first time. The B-side compiled 2 years of Skiz Player and Skiz Record originals into one official release. Up All Night got its proper streaming home, every voice in one place. Early 2023, Stray Kids released The Sound, their first Japanese studio album. The title track was a song 3racha had actually written years earlier and held back, waiting for the right moment. The lyrics declare this is the music of Stray Kids. They treated it as a full creative project, not a side release, and produced it entirely themselves. Then came 5 Star in 2023. Bangchan said something he'd probably been thinking for a while. The lines between Dance Racha, Vocal Racha, and 3racha are being blurred. Each of our members can do multiple positions now. He also said something that captured the whole shift more simply than anything else he'd offered. When we first debuted, it was like we were in a team, but now it's like there's a team in us. It's not that we fit into the circle of a team, it's like we're holding that circle together. That's how strong our colors have become. With Rockstar later that year, Hyunjin wrote a B-side called Cover Me, entirely by himself. Concept, lyrics, delivery, all of it. He recorded it in Bangchan's studio. Around the same time, 3racha attended a song camp where they worked with Charlie Puth. Bangchan talked about what it was like to watch him work. I put a lot of effort into my work. I tend to be very meticulous, but he looked like he was playing. He managed to do everything effortlessly. I learned a lot from that. He'd spent 8 years building through sustained efforts. Puth looked like he was playing. 3racha had been working on 8 since the previous October. They went through 4 submission deadlines and somewhere between 15 and 20 demos. At one point, they finished with a completely different style, They tried making mainstream pop with a touch of skiz, but when they listened back, it didn't sound like them at all, so they scrapped it. In 2018, they were still figuring out what Stray Kids sounded like from the inside. By 2024, they could feel when they'd missed it. The song that became the title track was made in a single night at a song camp with no plan at all. A track maker put together a rough riff, Changbin improvised a hook, and Bangchan built a pre-hook on the spot. They did a rough recording and forgot about it. Bangchan said they came back to it later and thought, let's try completing this. That ended up being Chick Chick Boom. Somewhere in the middle of all those failed demos, Changbin had written a track called Jam. He said he wasn't having fun back then, that he was in a rut, and that he made the song hoping he wouldn't lose the enjoyment he used to feel when writing. The thing that got them through a year of not finding the answer was making something just to remember why they loved doing it. Hop was their last album to release that year. The album compiled their solo tracks, which they each individually wrote and performed on their Dominate World Tour. Ian heard a track Changbin had originally written for the full group and asked if he could take it. Changbin listened back and agreed it fit Ian better than he planned. Ian took it and rewrote every single rap section as melody, reshaping the entire thing into something that could only have come from him. He said he didn't want to do something predictable, that he wanted to show a side of himself people hadn't seen. In 2018, Bangchan looked at Ian and saw a white canvas with a small dot in the middle. By 2024, Ian was the one deciding what went on the canvas. While they were on the Dominate World Tour, they kept writing. Hotel rooms, travel days, whatever space the schedule allowed. Karma was being built in the margins of everything else they were doing. Han had written a song called Mess back in 2021. He talked about how he'd been collecting words that felt underused, words people recognized but rarely reached for, and that mess was one of them. It finally found its home on Karma, nearly 5 years after he wrote it. Phoenix went through so many changes from its original form that the finished song sounds nothing like where it started. Bangchan wrote it, showed it to Seungmin and Lino, and what began as a radio concept intro eventually became a full EDM drum and bass album track. Just like Ordinary, Karma debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200. It was their 7th consecutive album to do that. Stray Kids also became the first act in Billboard history to have their first 7 entries debut at number 1, and then came Do It later that year. At a single song camp, they wrote 6 songs in 3 days, that we know of. Those songs ended up scattered across multiple releases. Chick Chick Boom and the Stray Kids track on 8, Phoenix on Karma, You featuring Tableau on Hop, and their new song, Do It. Changbin's lyrics for the title track included the line, "Just do it, quit testing the waters, for real, stop it." He said it was directed at other people, but also at himself, that he spends more time weighing things up than he'd like to admit. Han wrote a song called Holiday around this time, when he couldn't rest and the writing itself became the release. Holiday could almost serve as a grown-up version of Sunshine. He described it like keeping a diary, that saying the things out loud through the song let something out that he couldn't let out any other way. He connected it to Do It directly. He said Holiday is for when you want to break, whereas Do It is for when you can't physically take one. Back in 2019, Sunshine was 3 minutes of rest he gave to listeners because he couldn't take it himself. Years later, nothing had really changed about that pattern, but something had changed underneath it. After Hop wrapped up, Han talked about where he'd landed. "I became much healthier. I let go of a lot. I let go of so many negative things. Back then, not being able to sleep felt different from having trouble sleeping now. Not being able to sleep now is just because I want to do more, practice more, and see more." That's not the same person who wrote Sunshine, because he was afraid of falling behind. There was no clean moment where everything came together. No single album where the group suddenly arrived. There were slumps and a year of demos that went nowhere, and a member who left, and songs that took 5 years to find the right home. There was Changbin in a rut making Jam just to feel something familiar. There was Ian still writing You're Doing a Good Job to himself 3 years later into his career. But somewhere in all of it, there were 5 people who started out just performing and became people who couldn't stop creating. It happened because the 3 people who were already doing it built something real enough that it was worth the effort to join. If you want to see a deeper look at how the connection between 3RACHA was exactly the thing that led Stray Kids to change K-pop forever, you can click the video on screen. Thanks for watching! Bye 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 bye.